It started with a Craigslist ad. Samantha had just moved to a new city for her job and needed a place to live fast. When she found an ad for a room in a charming old house near downtown, it seemed like the perfect fit. The rent was low, the location was ideal, and the ad promised a quiet environment with respectful roommates. The landlord, a woman in her 50s named Donna, was friendly but firm. She stressed that the house had rules: no guests, no loud music, and no going into the basement. Samantha barely paid attention to that last one. Who cared about a basement? She signed the lease and moved in the next day. Her roommate Adam was an awkward man in his early 30s. He worked nights and kept to himself, which suited Samantha just fine. They exchanged polite hellos, but little else. Occasionally, she'd hear him in his room, muttering to himself or pacing late into the night. It was strange, but she chalked it up to stress. The first odd thing happened about a week in. Samantha noticed scratches on her bedroom door, long and jagged as if someone or something had been clawing at it. When she asked Adam about it, he shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Old house," he mumbled, then disappeared into his room. Then came the noises. In the middle of the night, Samantha would hear faint thuds and whispers coming from the basement. She reminded herself of the rules. No going down there. But curiosity gnawed at her. When she mentioned it to Donna, the landlord's cheerful tone turned icy. "That's none of your concern," she snapped. One night, the noises grew louder, banging and dragging like furniture being moved. Unable to take it anymore, Samantha crept down the stairs. The basement door was slightly ajar, and the faint glow of a light seeped through the crack. "Adam?" she called out. No response. Her heart pounding, she pushed the door open and descended the creaking steps. The air grew colder, heavier. At the bottom, she found a room lined with shelves of jars, each filled with murky liquid and things. Samantha couldn't make out what they were at first, but as she got closer, she realized they were small bones, tufts of hair, and what looked horrifyingly like human teeth. In the center of the room was a crude altar, smeared with something dark and sticky. Candles flickered around it, their flames casting long, eerie shadows. And then she saw it, a notebook, open to a page filled with Adam's scrawling handwriting. Roommate number 3, receptive, potential vessel. Before she could process what she was reading, she heard the door at the top of the stairs slam shut. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Samantha spun around to see Adam standing there, a twisted smile on his face, holding a knife that glinted in the candlelight. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said, his voice low and trembling with something unrecognizable. Samantha didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy jar, and hurled it at him. It shattered, sending its foul-smelling contents everywhere. Adam howled, momentarily distracted, and she seized her chance. She bolted up the stairs, her legs burning, and threw herself against the door. It wouldn't budge. Adam was right behind her now, his footsteps faster, heavier. Desperate, she shoved her shoulder against the door one last time, and it flew open. Samantha ran out into the night, screaming for help. The police arrived within minutes. They found Adam unconscious in the basement, surrounded by the disturbing artifacts Samantha had seen. But Donna? She was gone, leaving behind only a hastily written note. "You broke the rules." Samantha moved out the next day. The house was boarded up, and Adam was taken into custody. But every so often, Samantha dreams of that basement. She dreams of Adam's twisted smile and Donna's chilling words, and sometimes she wakes up to faint scratching on her bedroom door. The house was supposed to be a fresh start. Emma had left behind a messy breakup and a dead-end job, ready to rebuild her life in the quiet countryside. The house she rented was old but beautiful, a Victorian-style home with creaky floors and windows that rattled when the wind blew. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harlow, seemed eager to have a tenant. "It's just me now," she'd said. "The house can feel lonely." Emma didn't think much of it. She was ready for solitude. But something felt off from the moment she moved in. The first night, she discovered a locked room at the end of the hallway. The door was heavy, painted a dull green with a tarnished brass knob that wouldn't turn no matter how much she tried. When she asked Mrs. Harlow about it, the woman dismissed her with a wave of her hand. "Storage," she said, her eyes darting away. "Nothing you need to worry about." That night, Emma woke to a sound, a faint tapping like fingernails against glass. She sat up, her breath caught in her throat. The room was dark, but her eyes adjusted quickly, scanning for movement. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. Slowly, Emma approached, her heart pounding. She pulled back the curtain, expecting a branch or maybe a bird. Instead, there was a face. A pale, gaunt face pressed against the glass, its mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin. Empty, black sockets stared at her where eyes should have been. Emma screamed and stumbled back, her phone slipping from her grasp. When she looked again, the face was gone, leaving only condensation smeared on the glass. The next morning, she convinced herself it was a nightmare, though her hands shook as she made coffee. She avoided the window, and when Mrs. Harlow came by to drop off some paperwork, Emma mentioned the face. Mrs. Harlow froze. Her lips tightened, and she clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You must be tired," she said. "This house, it plays tricks on you." Over the next few days, the noises started. Scraping sounds in the walls, whispers just low enough to be unintelligible, and the tapping, always at 3 a.m., always at the same window. And then there was the green door. One night, Emma awoke to the sound of it creaking open. She bolted upright, her heart hammering in her chest. The hallway was pitch black, but she could see the door at the end of it was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. She grabbed her phone for a flashlight and crept toward it, each step louder than the last on the creaky wooden floor. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. When she reached the door, she hesitated. The air was cold here, colder than the rest of the house. She shone her flashlight into the room. It was empty, save for a small wooden chair in the center and deep scratches gouged into the floorboards around it, as if someone or something had been dragged away. Then she saw them. Footprints in the dust, leading from the chair to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed impossibly thick. She shone her light there, and for a moment she thought she saw movement. And then the door slammed shut behind her. Emma screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, coming from every direction. She felt a hand brush her shoulder, a cold, skeletal touch, and she whirled around, but there was no one there. The whispers turned to laughter, guttural and mocking, and she could hear the tapping again, this time louder, echoing from every wall. When the door finally opened, Mrs. Harlow stood on the other side, her face pale and her hands trembling. "I told you not to worry about it," she said. Emma moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. The landlord didn't seem surprised. Weeks later, Emma saw a news report about the house. It had burned down in the middle of the night, leaving nothing but charred remains. The fire department discovered bones in the basement, bones that didn't belong to Mrs. Harlow. Emma still dreams of the house, of the green door, and the laughter. Sometimes she wakes to the sound of tapping on her bedroom window. Megan needed a break. After months of grueling work hours, she booked a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the woods. The pictures online showed a quaint, cozy retreat surrounded by towering pines and an inviting fire pit. It was exactly what she needed: solitude, fresh air, and a chance to disconnect. When she arrived, the place looked just as it had in the photos, except for one thing. A mirror hung in the living room, massive and ornate, with a gold frame carved into twisting shapes that almost resembled faces. It hadn't been in the listing, but Megan figured it added charm. Still, there was something unsettling about it, the way it seemed to catch every shadow in the room. The first night was peaceful. Megan made dinner, read by the fireplace, and eventually fell asleep to the sound of crickets outside. But around 2 a.m., she woke up to the sound of faint footsteps. She froze in bed, straining to listen. The cabin was small, just one floor, and the only other room was the living area. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, as if someone was pacing. Megan grabbed her phone and crept out of bed. She peeked into the living room, but it was empty, just the mirror catching the dim glow of moonlight. Relieved, she blamed her imagination and went back to bed. The next day, she noticed something strange. In the reflection of the mirror, there was a figure sitting in the armchair by the fireplace. Megan spun around, but the chair was empty. She laughed nervously, telling herself it was a trick of the light, and avoided looking at the mirror for the rest of the day. That night, the footsteps returned. Megan bolted upright in bed, clutching the sheets. This time they were heavier, closer. She grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed into the living room. The mirror seemed to hum, a low vibration that made the air around it feel thick. She shone her flashlight on it, and for a second she saw her own reflection. Except it wasn't quite her. The reflection smiled. Megan stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, which rolled under the couch. When she looked up again, the reflection was normal, her pale, terrified face staring back at her. She grabbed her keys, deciding to leave immediately, but when she opened the front door, the woods were pitch black. The path she had driven in on was gone, replaced by endless rows of trees. Panicking, she called the rental owner. A man answered on the first ring. "Hello?" Megan said, her voice shaking. "I need help. There's something wrong with the cabin." The man was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. "You're still there?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I stopped renting that place months ago. Nobody stays past the first night." Megan's heart dropped. "What do you mean?" "The mirror," he said. "If it's still there, don't look at it. Whatever you do, don't." The call cut off, replaced by static. Megan turned around, her phone slipping from her hands. The mirror was no longer on the wall. It was standing in the middle of the room. Her reflection stepped out. The last thing Megan saw was herself, smiling with cold, empty eyes. When the rental owner arrived 2 days later to check on the cabin, it was empty. Megan's car was still parked outside, her belongings scattered in the living room. The only thing left was the mirror, returned to its place on the wall, and the faint sound of footsteps echoing from within. It started with a message. Lena's new apartment came with a few quirks. The old brick building had a charm to it. Creaky floors, a faint draft, and a history that stretched back over a century. She loved it, even if her friends teased her about the peeling wallpaper and outdated fixtures. She noticed the writing on the bathroom mirror her first night there. After a hot shower, steam coated the glass and faint words appeared. "Leave." Lena blinked, thinking it was a prank left by the previous tenant. She laughed it off, wiped the mirror clean, and told herself it was probably just her imagination. The next morning, she noticed something stranger. Her keys, which she always left on the kitchen counter, were on the coffee table. She didn't remember moving them, but again, she brushed it off. But then, things escalated. Every night, as the apartment grew quiet, Lena would hear faint whispers. She couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to come from the walls, growing louder when she tried to sleep. When she mentioned it to her landlord, he avoided her eyes and muttered something about old pipes and thin walls. One night, as she lay in bed scrolling on her phone, the whispers stopped. A heavy silence fell over the apartment. Then the doorknob to her bedroom began to rattle. Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The rattling stopped. She got up, grabbing a lamp for protection, and slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty, but a cold draft brushed past her, making her skin crawl. When she turned back to her room, her blood ran cold. The mirror on her dresser had fogged up, even though the room wasn't warm. Scrawled across it in what looked like dripping condensation were the words, "It's watching you." Lena barely slept that night. The next day, she decided to investigate. She started by asking her neighbors if they'd experienced anything strange. Most of them shrugged it off, but one elderly woman, Mrs. Connors, hesitated before speaking. "You're in 4B, aren't you?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Lena nodded. Mrs. Connors' face darkened. "No one stays there long. They say something happened in that apartment years ago. A man, he was obsessed with the tenants, watched them, took things from them. One night, he just disappeared." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. That night, she decided to stay up with all the lights on. Around midnight, she heard the whispers again, louder this time. They seemed to come from the closet in her bedroom. Her hands shaking, she approached the door. It was slightly ajar, and she could see darkness spilling out like a void. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice breaking. The whispering stopped. Then a voice, deep, gravelly, spoke from within. "I see you." Lena screamed and ran out of the apartment, not stopping until she was outside on the street. The next day, she broke her lease and left, refusing to return even to collect her belongings. Months later, she heard that the building was being renovated. Workers tore down the walls in 4B and discovered a crawl space hidden behind the closet. Inside, they found an old chair, a collection of personal items from various tenants, and a stack of Polaroid photos. Each one was of Lena, taken from inside the walls. The alarm clock read 3:07 a.m. when Sarah woke up to the sound of knocking. It was slow and deliberate, 3 sharp knocks on her bedroom door. Her heart raced as she sat up, straining to listen. Living alone in her small apartment, she knew there shouldn't be anyone else there. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The knocking didn't come again, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. She grabbed her phone and a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. The hallway was empty. Convinced it was her imagination, Sarah went back to bed. The next night, it happened again. This time, the knocking was louder, more insistent. She jolted awake, staring at the door as her breath came in short, panicked gasps. Knock, knock, knock. "Who's there?" she demanded, clutching her phone. Again, no response. Summoning her courage, she opened the door. The hallway was just as empty as before, but this time she noticed something new. Scratched into the paint on the door was a single word, "Soon." Her blood ran cold. The following day, Sarah contacted her landlord, a gruff man named Mr. Carter, who waved off her concerns. "Old building," he said. "These places make noises, doors creak, walls settle. Don't let your imagination get the better of you." But that night, Sarah heard more than knocking. As she lay in bed, trying to calm her frayed nerves, a soft voice began whispering her name. "Sarah! Sarah!" It was faint at first, but it grew louder, coming from all around her. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the voice seemed to seep into her mind, relentless and taunting. Desperate, she screamed, "Leave me alone!" The voice stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, almost suffocating. Then, from the corner of her room, she heard the sound of breathing. Slow, ragged. Her flashlight trembled as she aimed it toward the corner. For a moment, she thought it was empty, just shadows and her overactive imagination. But then she saw it. A figure stood there, hunched and gaunt, with skin stretched too tightly over its bones. Its hollow eyes glinted in the beam of her flashlight, and its mouth twisted into a crooked grin. "Soon," it rasped. Sarah bolted from the apartment, leaving everything behind. She didn't stop running until she reached the safety of a friend's house. When she returned the next day with a locksmith and her landlord, they found the apartment exactly as she had left it, except for one thing. The word "soon" was now scratched into every surface, the walls, the floors, the windows, even the mirror in the bathroom. Sarah never went back. The building eventually fell into disrepair and was condemned, but locals still talk about it, about the knocking that echoes through the hallways late at night, and the whispers of a name that changes with every tenant. It was supposed to be a harmless find. Jason and his friends loved urban exploring, abandoned houses, empty factories, forgotten places. When they heard about the old mansion on the outskirts of town, they couldn't resist. The locals called it the Hollow House, and stories of disappearances and strange happenings only added to its allure. The mansion was enormous, with broken windows and ivy choking its crumbling walls. Its front door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind as if inviting them in. Jason led the way, his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. The walls were lined with faded portraits of people with hollow eyes and unnatural smiles. "Creepy," muttered Sophie, one of Jason's friends, snapping a picture with her phone. As they moved deeper into the house, they came across a staircase spiraling down into the basement. The wood groaned under their weight, and the air grew colder with every step. The basement was vast and almost completely empty, save for a single object in the center of the room. A large, antique mirror. Its frame was blackened and twisted, like scorched wood, and the glass had a strange, rippling quality, as if it were a pool of liquid instead of a solid surface. "Dibs," joked Mark, another friend, tapping the glass. It didn't feel like normal glass. It was warm, almost alive. Jason didn't like the way the mirror seemed to pull at his reflection, distorting it ever so slightly when he moved. "Let's keep looking around," he said, wanting to leave it behind. But as they turned to go, Sophie gasped. "Guys, my reflection isn't moving." Jason whipped around. Sophie stood frozen, staring at the mirror. Her reflection was still looking at her, but it wasn't following her movements. Before anyone could react, Sophie's reflection smiled. It wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too sharp. The reflection reached a hand up to the glass and pressed against it from the inside. Sophie screamed, stumbling back, but her reflection didn't disappear. Instead, it began pounding on the glass, cracks spiderwebbing across the surface. The sound was deafening, a thunderous explosion of glass and howling wind. "Run!" Jason shouted, grabbing Sophie and pulling her toward the stairs. As they scrambled up, the mirror shattered behind them with a sound like a scream. But the shards didn't fall. They floated, spinning in the air like a storm of knives. They made it to the main floor, slamming the basement door behind them. But the house had changed. The front door was gone, replaced by a blank wall, and the windows were now solid black, reflecting nothing. "Where's Mark?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Jason turned to see that Mark wasn't with them. "Mark?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty halls. From somewhere in the house, they heard his voice. "Guys? Help!" The sound was faint, as if it were coming from deep within the walls. Jason and Sophie hesitated, torn between finding their friend and escaping the nightmare. But before they could decide, the walls began to shift, twisting and stretching as if the house were alive. From the shadows, they saw shapes emerging, reflections of themselves, like grinning with hollow eyes and jagged mouths. The reflections moved closer, their movements jerky and unnatural, mimicking Jason and Sophie's every step. Sophie grabbed Jason's arm. "We have to go!" They ran, darting through the endless hallways, chased by the sound of laughter, high-pitched, echoing, and inhuman. Finally, they found a door that hadn't been there before. Without thinking, they threw it open and stumbled outside into the cold night air. When they turned back, the mansion was gone. Just an empty, overgrown lot remained, the grass swaying in the breeze as if nothing had ever been there. Mark was never found. Years later, Jason still dreams of the mirror, of the way his reflection had lingered just a moment too long before they left. And sometimes when he looks into a mirror, he swears he sees Mark staring back at him, mouthing a single word, "Help." The doll wasn't supposed to be there. Rachel found it on her porch one rainy evening, sitting in a soggy cardboard box. She almost tripped over it as she stepped outside to grab the mail. The doll was old, with a porcelain face cracked like dried mud. Its glass eyes stared blankly ahead, and its mouth was painted into a faint, unsettling smirk. It wore a faded dress that might once have been white, now yellowed with age, and one of its tiny hands was missing. There was no note, no explanation, just the doll, alone in the box. Rachel should have thrown it away. She told herself as much, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the way it seemed to watch her, even as she turned to leave it there. Against her better judgment, she brought it inside. She left it on the kitchen counter and forgot about it until later that night. When she went to bed, the doll was in her living room. It was sitting upright in the armchair by the window, its cracked face tilted toward her. Rachel froze, certain she had left it in the kitchen. "Maybe I moved it," she muttered, though her voice wavered. She picked up the doll, dropped it in a box, and shoved the box into the back of her closet. The next morning, the doll was back in the armchair. Rachel's stomach churned as she stared at it. "This isn't funny," she said aloud, though she lived alone. She grabbed the doll, marched outside, and threw it in the trash bin at the curb. That night, the knocking began. It was soft at first, barely audible. She thought it might be the wind, but it grew louder, more persistent, and it was coming from the closet where she had first put the doll. Rachel sat frozen on the couch, staring at the closet door. The knocking stopped, then it opened. The doll was there, sitting in the middle of the floor, its smirk wider, its head tilted as if mocking her. Rachel didn't sleep that night. The next day, she drove the doll to the nearest dump, tossing it into a pit of garbage and driving off without looking back. She felt relief for the first time in days, convinced it was over. But when she returned home, the doll was waiting for her on the front porch. This time, its glass eyes weren't blank. They were red, as if blood had seeped into the cracks, and its smirk had stretched into a jagged, open grin. Panicked, Rachel grabbed it and set it on fire in her backyard. She watched the flames consume its dress, its cracked face blackening and melting. But as the doll burned, it screamed. It wasn't a sound she could explain, high-pitched and inhuman, a shriek that echoed in her ears long after the flames died out. Rachel thought it was over. She convinced herself it was, until she woke up the next morning to find the charred remains of the doll on her pillow, its glass eyes staring into hers, its cracked lips mouthing a single word: "Stay." Rachel's neighbors never saw her again. Her house stood empty for months before being sold. The new owners found a doll in the attic, its porcelain face cracked but smiling. And every night they hear soft knocks, coming from everywhere and nowhere, as the doll whispers their names. It started with a smell. Emma had just moved into her new apartment, a cozy little unit on the third floor of an old building downtown. She loved the place. High ceilings, vintage charm, and just enough space for her to feel at home. The first night was uneventful. But by the second, a strange metallic odor began to fill the air. It was faint at first, like rust, but grew stronger as the night wore on. She checked everything. The pipes, the vents, even the fridge. Nothing seemed out of place. By the third night, the smell was unbearable. It was so strong that Emma could hardly breathe. It clung to her clothes, her skin, and the very walls of the apartment. She decided to call the landlord, but as she reached for her phone, she heard something. A faint dripping sound. It was coming from the ceiling. Emma looked up to see a small, dark stain spreading across the plaster above her bed. The dripping grew louder, and when she placed a bucket underneath it, a thick, reddish liquid began to pool at the bottom. Her stomach churned. Convinced it was a burst pipe or something equally mundane, Emma called the landlord the next morning. He promised to send someone to check it out. But by the time the maintenance man arrived, the stain had vanished. "There's nothing here," he said, scratching his head. "No leaks, no damage? You sure you weren't imagining it?" Emma bit her tongue and nodded, though her unease only deepened. That night, the stain returned. It wasn't just a small patch anymore. It spread across the entire ceiling, dark and wet, pulsating as if it were alive. The metallic smell was overwhelming, and the dripping turned into a steady stream. Emma bolted out of her apartment, spending the night at a friend's place. The next morning, she went back to find the apartment pristine. No stain, no smell, no sign of anything unusual. She decided to research the building, hoping to find some logical explanation. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Years ago, there had been a murder in her apartment. The previous tenant, a man named Lucas, had killed his girlfriend during a violent argument. Unable to live with his guilt, Lucas hanged himself in the bedroom, the same room Emma now slept in. The stain, she realized, was forming in the exact spot where his body had been found. Terrified, Emma packed her things and prepared to leave. But as she reached for the front door, she froze. The metallic smell was back, stronger than ever, and the air around her grew heavy. Slowly, she turned around. Lucas stood in the corner of the room. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and lifeless. A rope hung loosely around his neck, the noose swaying gently as if moved by an invisible breeze. He raised a hand, pointing at the ceiling. Emma's gaze followed, and she saw the stain again, but this time, it wasn't just a stain. Faces pressed against the plaster, their mouths open in silent screams. "Stay," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. "You can't leave. None of us can." Emma ran, leaving everything behind. When the landlord called to check on her, the line went dead after a few seconds. When he sent someone to check on the unit, they found it empty, except for the bedroom. The ceiling was covered in stains, dark and wet, and the faint sound of dripping echoed through the room. No one has rented the apartment since. The voicemail was strange. Maya noticed it after a long shift at the hospital. Her phone buzzed with a notification. New voicemail. She frowned, realizing her phone hadn't rung all day. The message was short, just a few seconds of silence followed by a faint whisper. "Help me." Maya shivered. The voice was distorted, almost mechanical, but she dismissed it as a prank or a misdial. She deleted the message and went to bed. The next morning, there was another voicemail. This time, the voice was clearer. "Why didn't you help me?" Maya's stomach churned. She checked the number, but it was blocked. She played the message again, her heart pounding as she heard the faint sound of breathing in the background. That night, she left her phone on silent, refusing to check it. But the next morning, her voicemail icon blinked again. "I'm coming," the voice whispered. Maya's hands trembled as she deleted the message. She called her carrier, demanding to know who had been calling her. The representative apologized, saying there was no record of any incoming calls to her number. The voicemails didn't stop. Every night, a new one appeared, each more unsettling than the last. The voice spoke her name now, sometimes in a pleading tone, other times in a low, guttural growl. "I'm so close. I see you. I'll be there soon." Maya stopped sleeping, paranoia eating away at her. She double-checked the locks on her doors and windows, jumped at every shadow, and avoided her phone entirely. But the voicemails kept coming, even when her phone was off. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. She screamed into the phone, "Who are you? What do you want?" The line crackled, and the voice replied, "I was you." Maya froze, her blood running cold. "What does that mean?" she whispered. But the line went dead. The next day, Maya noticed something strange. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror looked wrong. It was subtle at first, just a delayed movement or a slight difference in her expression. But by the evening, her reflection was grinning at her when she wasn't smiling. Panicked, Maya covered every mirror in her apartment and unplugged her phone, but the voicemails didn't stop. The final message came at 3:33 a.m. "Open the door," the voice said. A loud knock echoed through her apartment, and Maya's heart stopped. Slowly, she crept to the door, peeking through the peephole. No one was there. But when she turned back, her reflection was waiting for her. It stood in the uncovered mirror, holding up her phone. On the screen, a new voicemail played. It was her own voice this time, whispering, "I'm here." The last thing Maya saw was her reflection stepping through the glass. The next morning, Maya's neighbors reported hearing strange noises from her apartment, but no one answered when they knocked. When the police arrived, they found the place empty. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, still recording with a single voicemail left behind. The message simply said, "She's gone." The elevator ride should have been routine. Daniel worked late, the last one in his office building as usual. It was nearly midnight when he finally powered down his computer, grabbed his bag, and headed for the elevator. The building was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to press against your ears. As Daniel stepped into the elevator, he noticed something odd. The buttons for the floors weren't lit. He pressed L for the lobby. The doors closed and the elevator jolted slightly before beginning its descent. Then it stopped. The lights flickered, plunging the tiny space into brief darkness before dimly returning. Daniel pressed the door open button, but nothing happened. He hit it again, harder this time. Still nothing. "Great," he muttered, pulling out his phone. No signal. As he debated whether to call for help from the emergency panel, the elevator jolted again, but instead of going down, it began to rise. The floor indicator blinked erratically. 3, 7, 5, 9. The numbers didn't make sense, skipping and repeating at random. "What the hell?" Daniel said, pressing the buttons for the lobby and emergency stop, but the elevator ignored him. Then, with a loud ding, the doors slid open. The hallway beyond was dimly lit with peeling wallpaper and a strange, acrid smell. It wasn't his office building anymore, or at least not a part of it he recognized. Daniel hesitated, instinct telling him not to step out. But as he moved to press the closed door button, a voice echoed from the hallway. "Help me." It was faint, almost a whisper. "Hello?" Daniel called, leaning out slightly to look down the hall. There was no response, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Please, help me." Against his better judgment, Daniel stepped out. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the floor beneath his feet felt soft, like walking on damp carpet. The voice continued, drawing him further down the corridor. The walls seemed to close in as he walked, the dim light flickering overhead. Finally, he reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and the voice was coming from inside. "Hello?" he called again, pushing the door open. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a cassette recorder, its tape spinning. "Help me," the voice repeated from the recorder. Daniel felt the hairs on his neck stand up. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The walls began to ripple, the peeling wallpaper curling back to reveal something dark and pulsating underneath. The voice changed, growing deeper and more guttural. "You shouldn't have come." Daniel pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls now oozing with a thick black substance that smelled of decay. Suddenly, the tape stopped. The room went silent. Then, from the corner, something moved. A figure emerged from the shadows, its body unnaturally twisted, its face a featureless void. It reached out with impossibly long arms, its fingers brushing against Daniel's shoulder. The last thing he heard before everything went dark was the voice whispering in his ear, "You're mine now." The next morning, the building's janitor found the elevator stuck on the 13th floor. The doors were open, but there was no sign of Daniel, just his bag lying in the middle of the empty elevator. And etched into the metal walls, as if by claws, were the words, "Don't follow the voices.